Good morning. All right, today we begin a new series on the Old Testament book of Esther. I will start off by telling you what the book of Esther is about and also a little bit of what the book of Esther is not about. And I guess I'll start with what the book of Esther is not about. Esther is not a woman's Bible study book. Did you know that? I mean, it actually is a woman's Bible study book in actual use, because that's what's happened with the book of Esther. It has become a woman's Bible study book, but I'm saying it wasn't written for that purpose. It is not specifically a woman's book. If you have like a regular Bible or even one that's on your phone, I think it probably still has a table of contents in the front. And if you look at the books of the Bible, you'll notice there are several of them that are named after men, right? Job, Nehemiah, Mark, James. These are books of the Bible that have men's names. There are also several books that are named after gender-neutral things, like Numbers, Judges, Proverbs, Revelation. And then there are two books in the Bible that are named after women's names, Esther and Ruth. And because there's 66 books in the Bible and two are named after women, women have gravitated toward these two books. And sometimes these two books have even been treated almost like a how-to guide as to how to be a godly woman. I don't know, maybe have any of you women in here been to a Bible study where it's either on Ruth or on Esther, and the idea of it is, let's be a godly woman like Esther, or we need to become a godly woman like Ruth, right? And this is how you find a husband the way Ruth did, which if you know the story, like that's typically not the way you find a husband. And they're not really how-to guides on how to be godly women, but there have been lots of times where women have, said, hey, come over to my house for tea and we're going to study Esther, or come over and we'll have a tea and we'll study Ruth. But this book that we're going to learn is not primarily about womanhood. There are two main characters in the book of Esther, and their names are Mordecai and Esther. And to be honest, the book could have ended up being named after either one of them. Okay, Mordecai and Esther are the two main characters in the story, and had the book been named, if the book was named Esther, which it was, you would perceive Esther to be the main character, and Mordecai would have just been the other main character. But if the book had been named Mordecai, you would have perceived Mordecai to be the main character and Esther to be the other main character. If you've never thought about that before, maybe you can't do it, but if you could imagine the book were named Mordecai and you read it, I don't think there's any point that you'd go, this is crazy. What's it named Mordecai for? It's all about this girl named Esther. It's about Esther and Mordecai. And so it got named Esther, and that's why we associate it with all this woman stuff. But let's say it had been named Mordecai. I don't think then it would have become one of the go-to books for the women's Bible studies. In fact, once we get through it, you'll see it's kind of a grisly book. I don't even think it really is a particularly feminine book, actually. But there it is. So if you're a woman here and you protest, hey, why are you trying to take away one of the only two books that we've got? What I'm saying is I'm not taking away any books. I'm trying to say you don't only have two books, okay? Whether a book of the Bible is named after a woman or a man or a gender-neutral thing, I'm letting you know all of the books of the Bible are for everybody, okay? Amen? Okay, so this series will probably be 2 weeks long. That's what I'm thinking at this point. It is about an important story, and we'll be talking about how it applies to all Christians, men and women. Why would we do this book in 2 weeks, right? In fact, I've already been asked that by a couple people that were surprised. Wait a minute, we were in Mark for a decade. Why? How in the world are you going to do Esther in 2 weeks? So my reason, first of all, the reason I want to do Esther in 2 weeks, one reason is because it's too long to cover in 1 week. Esther is 10 chapters long, and that's too much, I think, to cover in 1 week. Not that it couldn't be done. I'm sure some pastor somewhere has told the whole story of Esther all in 1 week. But I think in order to do that, you really would either have to have a really long sermon, or you'd have to leave out a whole bunch of parts. And so I want to cover the whole thing, and so I think it's going to take 2 weeks. But someone might go, well, wait a minute, if there's 10 chapters in it, why would you just do it in 2 weeks? Why not do a 10-week series on the book of Esther, right? 1 week per chapter, and we'll be in Esther for 10 weeks, okay? That's still a fraction of the time we were in Mark. But the reason I'm not going to do a 10-week series in Esther is I don't think that the book of Esther is about 10 things, okay? The book of Mark has a lot of individual little parts to it, but the book of Esther, I don't think it's about 10. For you to do 10 sermons, you kind of have to teach it, and then you have to say, no, this is what it's about, and I don't think that Esther is about 10 things. I think really there's one main theme to this book. I think Esther is about one thing. It has one point. If you were to ask the author of the book of Esther what his point was, or her point, I don't know. We don't know who the author of Esther is. It's an anonymous book in the Old Testament. But if you were to ask the author of the book what their point was, I think that they could tell you the answer in one sentence. I don't think they would say, well, it's about It's about 10 different things. It's about femininity, and it's about women's Bible studies, and it's about government, and it's about oppression, and it's about, I think that if you ask the author of the book of Esther, what's your book about? I think that probably he or she would say, it's the explanation for why we celebrate Purim. That's why I wrote it. That there's a whole generation of people that are celebrating this Jewish festival, Purim, and I want them to know why. I want them to know what the story was. We're talking about how God rescued us. They need to know, what was it that God did when he rescued us? This is the story as to why we celebrate Purim. You may have never heard of Purim, but it's a Hebrew festival or a Hebrew Jewish holiday, and I would say its relationship to the book of Esther is very similar to the relationship between Passover and the book of Exodus. So if you're familiar with that, Jewish people have been celebrating Passover for a long time, thousands of years now, and if you say, well, what is it about? They would point to the story in the book of Exodus. There was a time when the Israelite people, the Hebrew people, were there in Egypt, and they were enslaved. They were oppressed, and they cried out, and God heard their cries, and he rescued them. He got them out of slavery. He got them out of captivity, and he brought them to this promised land, and he got them out of Egypt. And if you read the book of Exodus, you'll see the exact place where God does what he does, and then they go, and we will remember this forever, Passover. And so Passover is the way that it's the thing that was written down. Like as we do Passover now, we look back to the story in Exodus, and in a very similar way, Purim is connected to the story of Esther. We celebrate that God rescued us. Which time? Not the time from Egypt, the other time. The time in the book of Esther. So I think that's the big point here. People should know how God delivered his people in this particular time, and so that's the story we're going to learn. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Esther chapter 1. Before I read the first verse, I'll give you a little bit of background on this book. The events that take place in the book of Esther take place about 475 years before the time of Christ. So all that stuff that we learned when we were learning the Gospel of Mark, this is about 475 years before that, which might sound like a long time before the time period of Christ, but actually it means it's one of the last things that happened in the Old Testament. For those of you that don't know, there's about a 400-year period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, okay, between Malachi and Matthew. So if you have something that took place 475 years before the time of Jesus, you're talking about something that took place at the very tail end of the Old Testament. And so if I were going to really quickly give you a timeline of the Old Testament, you start with Genesis. God created the world. He chooses this man named Abraham and says, I'm going to bless the whole world through you. We eventually find out that blessing the whole world through him has to do with Jesus in the New Testament. But in the meantime, he has Isaac and Jacob has kids, and those kids become a whole big nation called Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. They are oppressed in Egypt, as I referred to earlier. God rescues them from Egypt, as I referred to earlier, and they go into the promised land. They drive out their enemies from them. God uses them to judge the pagan nations that are in the promised land, and they set up their kingdom there. There's about 3 kings for the time period that it's going well is about 3 kings worth of times. And then they split into 2 kingdoms. And then there's 2 sets of kingdoms, two different Israels, Israel and Judah. And eventually bad guys come in and conquer both halves of Israel. Now, when the bad guys come in and conquer both halves of Israel, they kill lots of the Jewish people, but not all of them. Some of them they capture and they take to their foreign lands, to their capital cities or the places where they're from. And so there are now a bunch of Jewish people living in captivity in these foreign lands rather than living in the promised land. That period of time is called the exile. Esther, as best as I can tell, takes place toward the end of the exile, and that's kind of one of the last things that happens in the Old Testament. So you have the exile is these Jewish people are living in these other countries like Babylon. The book of Daniel happens during this time. The Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego story happens at this time. Jeremiah is written during this time. Nehemiah is one of the people that goes back to rebuild Israel after he's been taken away from it. All that stuff's happening during that time, at the tail end of all that. So at the end of the Old Testament, this story takes place. It's one of the last things that took place. There are Jewish people that are all spread out all over the world, and the world power at the time that Esther is written is Persia, or the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. So Persia's the world power, giant kingdom, Jewish people living in all different provinces in this kingdom, and the king of the kingdom at the time of Esther's name is Xerxes, or King Ahasuerus. He has 2 different names. Xerxes is his Persian name. Ahasuerus is his Hebrew name. So that's what's taking place, okay? All of the Old Testament stuff happened. Persia's now in power. Jewish people living in Persia. Xerxes, or King Ahasuerus, who that's what I'm going to call him because that's what Esther calls him. King Ahasuerus is in charge, and that's where the book of Esther begins. So, verse 1 of chapter 1. Here we go. These events took place during the days of Ahasuerus, who ruled 127 provinces from India to Kush. That would be a huge piece of land. In those days, King Ahasuerus reigned from his royal throne in the fortress at Susa. He held a feast in the 3rd year of his reign for all his officials and staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the officials from the provinces. He displayed the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the magnificent splendor of his greatness for a total of 180 days. At the end of this time, the king held a week-long banquet in the garden courtyard of the royal palace for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were present in the fortress of Susa. So that is how the story begins. You have a giant kingdom. You have a king over top of the giant kingdom, and he is showing off. He is taking a whole bunch of time to show off the glory of his splendor and the magnificence of his greatness to all these people, and he's throwing a huge party. And so I'll pick up now in verse 8. And no restraint was placed on the drinking. The king had ordered every wine steward in his household to serve as much as each person wanted. So he's throwing this big party, and it's an open bar, right? Okay, everybody can drink as much as they want. So when you're thinking about a bunch of people who, especially you're thinking of an arrogant king who is talking about how awesome he is for 180 days and then 7 more, and then there's an open bar and everyone can drink as much as they want. Like, it's almost like a hint something dumb's about to happen, isn't it? Okay, so there's no restraint placed on the drinking, and there they go. Now, at the same time, something else is happening. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women of King Ahasuerus' palace. So Queen Vashti, the husband to King Ahasuerus, also gives a feast. Okay? So apparently, the open bar feast that's happening for 7 days, that's mentioned just before this, is a men-only thing, right? That's the men all partying and drinking as much as they want. And I guess in a separate part of the palace or in some separate place, there was a woman's party going on at the same time. It doesn't say I don't know if they had an open bar or not. I don't know how much drinking they were doing. It specifies that the men were. It doesn't specify what the women were doing. But they were there, probably drinking tea and studying the book of Ruth, honestly. Just kidding. Anyway, so Queen Vashti gave a feast for the women of King Ahasuerus' palace. So those 2 parties are happening simultaneously. Now, verse 10. On the 7th day, when the king was feeling good from the wine. You following? All right. Ahasuerus commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who personally served him, which let me just pause here. Those are people's names, and wouldn't you hate to have the name Carcass? I mean, someone goes, listen up, Carcass, and you're like, hey, well, that is my name. Anyway, I doubt that his name meant what Carcass means in modern English, but still. Anyway, so these are the names of the 7 eunuchs who personally served him, and what he asks them to do is he says, bring Queen Vashti before me with her royal crown. Bring Queen Vashti before him with her royal crown. He wanted to show off her beauty to the people and the officials because she was very beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command that was delivered by his eunuchs. The king became furious, and his anger burned within him. So, what is going on here? Well, the king says to the queen, I want you to leave the women's party and come to the men's party, and I want to show off your beauty. And she says no. But what is going on here? Why is he angry at her? Why did she say no? What is going on with this whole situation? And the answer is we don't know for sure, but I want to let you know there are some people who have speculated that when the king said, Queen Vashti needs to show up over here at the men's party wearing her royal crown, that he meant wearing only her royal crown. That was the way he wanted to show off her beauty. Is that what's happening here? I don't know for sure. The passage does not specify that. I don't know for sure. But the reason I'm bringing it up is if that were the case, it does make sense of the story. I feel like either that's the case or something like that must have been going on, because when you look at the story, these are the things that kind of fit with that as I read it. First of all, the fact that the request was made and the story specifies it was made on the 7th day when the king was feeling good from the wine. So it almost seems like the writer of Esther is specifying the decision that he made to ask the queen to come was the kind of decision you would make when feeling good from wine, right? Not the kind of decision you would make when sober. Right? It seems to be that's a hint here, that he's asking something that he wouldn't have normally asked if he were sober. He specifically says that the point of it was to show off her beauty. I don't know how much clothing he wanted on her as he showed off her beauty. But the thing that seems to be, it either fits this or there's some other cultural thing going on that I don't understand, is the fact that asking her to come to his party offended her so much that she refused. which would make sense if she was supposed to come only wearing her crown. But maybe it was something else. Maybe there's some other cultural thing and women weren't supposed to. I don't really know. But it seems in the story that something offended her enough that she was willing to say, when the messengers came, she was willing to go, that sounds like something he'd say when he's drunk, and I am not doing that. And she says no. And that is a big deal. The fact that she refused the king is a big deal. We are living in a different culture, a different country, in a different time period than they are, and so it might not stick out to us as such a big deal. We don't have a king that is supposed to be obeyed, their every word be obeyed, and they can just kill someone if the person doesn't do what they say. We live in a country where we have a president. There are people who say no to the president in certain circumstances, right? And the president can't just have them killed. And you're going to see this as the story goes on. The king has huge power here. You don't say no to him. He can just have you killed. And so she says no. And the king became furious, and his anger burned within him. And then I'm not going to read the rest of chapter 1. I'm just going to summarize it. But basically, the king goes to his advisors and goes, what do we do? She said no. And I don't know how much time passed, but it almost seems like they are still feeling good from the wine as they're having this discussion about what do we do. Because, at least in my opinion, what the advisors say is a huge overreaction to the problem. Okay? Huge overreaction. She said no, what do I do? The advisors all go, punish her. Okay, you need to dethrone her. And if you read the rest of chapter 1, you'll see that the reason that they say dethrone her, this is what they say. I guess they believed it. They said, this is going to destroy all of the relationships between all the husbands and wives in the whole kingdom if you don't do something about this. If you just do nothing, if you don't dethrone her and make an example of her right now, not just her, all the wives in the whole kingdom, they will all start disrespecting their husbands. That's what they believed would happen. If this is tolerated, there's going to be other women in the kingdom, our wives, that are going to come up to us, or, well, I don't know if it was the eunuchs or not. If it was, they didn't have wives. But somebody's wives. Yeah, it is. It's a whole different group of advisors. Yep, Karshina, Shethar, Adamathar, Tarshish. Okay, anyway, so there's this group of guys, and they're going, listen, the whole kingdom is going to get uprooted because of this. This is not good at all. They're going to be men that ask their wives to do stuff or tell their wives to do stuff, and the wife is going to go, I say no, because I heard that Queen Vashti said no, right? And he's the king. And you, sir, are no king, right? And this is going to ruin what we've got going on in this kingdom. All the women are going to disrespect all the men. It's going to destroy everything around here. You got to do something about it. You should dethrone her. And the king goes, okay, and he does. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, sometime later, this is verse 1 of chapter 2. Sometime later, when King Ahasuerus' rage had cooled down, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what was decided against her. The king's personal attendants suggested, let a search be made for beautiful young women for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in each province of his kingdom so that they may assemble all the beautiful young women to the harem at the fortress of Susa. Put them under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and give them the required beauty treatments. I'll stop right there. So what you have here is the beginning of a plan that you're going to see unfold over the course of this chapter. That they say, you don't have a queen. We got an idea how to fix that. Let's have a beauty contest. Let's find all the most beautiful women in the kingdom. Let's gather them all together, and you'll pick one, and that'll be the new queen. And as the story goes on, you'll see it's actually even more than a beauty contest. But we're going to have this beauty contest, and so let's bring all the women, and you can pick them, and we'll put them, all of these kind of beautiful young women, the virgins, the people that haven't been married yet, all these women, we're going to bring them all together at the fortress of Susa. We put them under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, which I'm going to go ahead and explain this word eunuch right now, since it's been used, I don't know, at least twice, and I think it comes up later on in the book. A eunuch was an official or a servant or someone that was kind of on staff in the king's palace or in the king's kingdom who worked for him. And it was specifically a man who had been castrated. Okay, so this is a man who they have removed some of his private parts. And I don't know exactly all the reasons for that. You can look it up on History Channel, and maybe they will know more than I looked into it. But I think it may have to do with that he didn't want these people to rise up and begin dynasties of their own, that they wanted to have officials that worked for the king that were focused on the king and not on their families and stuff like that, so they'd be unable to have children. And in fact, in this particular case, if you're going to gather the most beautiful women of the kingdom and have all of them in a harem somewhere, and you're going to have someone that's going to be in charge of them, who would we pick? Hegai, the king's eunuch. That makes sense, right? The guy who's missing some private parts, let's put him in charge of the women. If it's the king's women and we don't want them messed with, right? So for whatever reason, that's what's going on there. That's what a eunuch is. So he's in charge of the women and give them the required beauty treatments. Verse 4, then the young woman who pleases the king, that's like the winner of the contest, will become queen instead of Vashti. This suggestion pleased the king, and he did accordingly. Right? He heard this idea of let's pick all the beautiful women, then you try them out, you pick the one, and he thought, I've heard of worse ideas. So he did it. Verse 5. Now this is like a little stop in that part of the story, and now we get introduced to the main characters. Main characters of the story. Here they are, verse 5. In the fortress of Susa, there was a Jewish man named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shammai, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. He had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the other captives when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took King Jeconiah of Judah into exile. That's part of Israel's history earlier on than this that I was quickly referring to earlier. So he was brought into exile. Mordecai was the legal guardian of his cousin, Hadassah, that is Esther. Okay, so Hadassah and Esther, that's all one person. Just like Xerxes and Ahasuerus is the same king, Esther and Hadassah are the same woman, but the book calls her Esther for the rest of it, so I'll refer to her as Esther. So Mordecai is the legal guardian of his cousin, Esther, because she didn't have a father or mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was extremely good looking. When her father and mother died, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. So those are our two main characters. Mordecai and Esther are related. Biologically, he is her cousin, but relationally, he is her dad. Okay? It says she didn't have a father and mother. I mean, obviously, at some point, she had a father and mother in order to come into existence. They died, is what I assume happened, and so cousin Mordecai becomes her adoptive father. So he's her dad. Verse 8. When the king's command and edict became public knowledge, many young women gathered at the fortress of Susa under Hegai's care. Esther was also taken to the palace. And when it says many women were gathered, I don't know, it's hard for me to know exactly how much of this was voluntary and how much of this was like forced upon them. And that's going to matter later on with some comments that I make about this beauty contest. I don't know if this is one of those things where the women were into it and they were going, like wanting to be on The Bachelor or something. Like, I want to be in the contest. I want to try. I'm into this. I want to compete to be the queen. And how much of this was just like, you're a young, beautiful woman, and I'm a Persian official, and you have to do what I say, come to the harem for part of this, for this contest. So I don't know how much of this was voluntary and how much of this was not. But whatever it is, Esther gets involved. Esther was also taken to the palace and placed under the care of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. The young woman this is Esther, pleased him and gained his favor so that he accelerated the process of the beauty treatments and the special diet that she received. He assigned 7 hand-picked female servants to her from the palace and transferred her and her servants to the harem's best quarters. Esther did not reveal her ethnic background or her birthplace because Mordecai had ordered her not to. This is important. Esther does not reveal her birthplace, and I don't understand what that means. I don't know what her birthplace was. I would think that her birthplace was not Israel because this was toward the end of the exile. I would assume that she was born somewhere in one of these empires. So I'm not sure what that is referring to. But ethnic background's obvious. She's Jewish. And Mordecai tells her, don't tell anybody. The passage doesn't tell us why Mordecai told her not to tell anybody, but it's obvious that he was concerned about something that might happen if people knew. So he just said, don't tell anyone. And she obeyed her dad. Verse 11. Every day, and by the way, obeying her dad in this particular situation is going to have a huge effect on the rest of the story. Verse 11, every day Mordecai took a walk in front of the harem's courtyard to learn how Esther was doing and to see what was happening to her. It's his daughter. He cares about her. He's checking up on her. Verse 12, during the year before each young woman's turn to go to King Ahasuerus, the harem regulation required her to receive beauty treatments with oil of myrrh for 6 months and then with perfumes and cosmetics for another 6 months. When the young woman would go to the king, she was given whatever she requested to take with her from the harem to the palace. She would go in the evening, and in the morning, she would return to a second harem under the supervision of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch in charge of the concubines. She never went to the king again unless he desired her and summoned her by name. This part of the story is terrible. And I did not realize it. Like growing up, I learned this story. Like as a kid, I learned the story of Esther. And I guess the children's teachers, I guess they do a good job of leaving parts out that maybe you're not supposed to know when you're 7. But as I go back as an adult and I read this, I go, whoa, this is so much worse than I thought it was as a kid. So what's happening here is you've got these women, I assume that they're the virgins of the kingdom. These are people who the king has not slept with yet, and they're living under Hegai's care. And then it comes for their turn to be presented to the king. It says they come in the evening and they leave in the morning. It does not specifically specify what they do. I do not think it's hard to imagine what's going on. Right? So the king gets to try each one out for a night, right? From the evening to the morning, and then he sends her on her way in the morning. And in the morning, she returns to a second harem under the supervision of a different eunuch named Shazgaz, which means there's two different harems. There's the ones he's not used yet, and there's the ones he's already used, right? There's the king hasn't done anything with him yet, and then there's another group of ladies that he has slept with at least one time. Those are called the concubines. And if he didn't like his first experience, he has the right to never, ever speak to her again. Yet she remains one of the concubines. So now you have this two different collections of women, and in the second collection, I guess in some ways maybe their life was maybe better than some other people's in the kingdom, in the sense that they were now part of the king's harem. They were there living in the fortress at Susa. They probably had all of their needs taken care of, and maybe they didn't have as difficult a life as maybe some poor women in the kingdom did. But they also had the fact that maybe they only spent one night with the king, and then that was it forever. And now they can never be married, and they can't ever go start their own family. They're just one of the king's used women until they die. And Esther is in that system. She, right at this point of the story, she's in group 1, and she's about to move to group 2. And if he never wants to see her again, he doesn't ever have to see her again unless he summons her by name. So he does, and I'll just let you know, she wins. Esther wins the contest. Verse 17. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. Now, I don't know what's going on here as far as remember how I told you earlier, I don't know if it's voluntary or if it's not voluntary that these women are in these harems. And so for that reason, what's going on here obviously is either a one-night stand or a rape. So we've got, if it's voluntary, you've got the king does a one-night stand, then makes his decision. And if it's not voluntary, the king rapes somebody and then moves on to the next one. Whatever it was in the case of Esther, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. When it was her turn, he went, this is the one. She won more favor and approval from him than did any of the other young women. He placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. And that is how Esther is chosen as the new queen. That's why the book bears her name. She becomes the new queen of Persia. Before we move off of this chapter, I'll just read you one more little piece of thing that happens here that will matter for next week, and it is Mordecai foiling an assassination plot. So let me just read you verses 21 through 23 real quick. During those days, meaning during the days that Esther was queen, okay, during this period of time that Esther's the queen, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, that's two people's names, two eunuchs who guarded the king's entrance, became infuriated and planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus. I do not know what they were upset at him about, but apparently at some point they were mad at him, maybe for the way that he had treated them. I don't know. Maybe they didn't want to be eunuchs. I'm not sure. But at some point they are very angry at Ahasuerus. They have some reason for it. And they want to kill him. And I guess they talk about it maybe out loud, and Mordecai can hear it. But it says when Mordecai learned of the plot, he reported it to Queen Esther, right? His daughter is the queen. I don't think anybody knows that at this point. But his daughter's the queen, and so it's reported to Queen Esther, and she told the king on Mordecai's behalf. When the report was investigated and verified, both men, Bigthan and Teresh, that were trying to kill him, both men were hanged on the gallows. This event was recorded in the historical record in the king's presence. So Mordecai finds out about an assassination attempt. He foils it by telling his daughter, the queen, to tell the king, who looks into it and takes care of it. That will matter for next week, but let's go ahead now to chapter 3. In chapter 3, we now get to the main conflict of the story. We now get interested. So Mordecai and Esther are our main characters. Here's the bad guy. He's coming in chapter 3. You might go, isn't the king the bad guy? Yeah, I think he's a bad guy, but he's not the bad guy of this story. The bad guy of the story is Haman, and he's introduced in chapter 3. After all this took place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite. He promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. So at some point, and I don't know the story behind this, the king exalts this man named Haman to be second in command, I guess, of the entire empire. The entire royal staff at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman because the king had commanded this to be done for him. Or at least he's second in command in this in Susa. So you got to bow down to him when he walks by. But who doesn't do it? Look at the second half of verse 2. Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage. So he's one of the people that's there in that area. The members of the royal staff at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why are you disobeying the king's command? Why won't you bow down and show respect to Haman when he walks by? When they had warned him day after day, this was not a one-time thing, this is over and over again, every single time Haman goes by, he will not bow down, he will not do the respect that is commanded for him to do of this second-in-command guy. He still would not listen to them. They told Haman to see if Mordecai's actions would be tolerated, since he had told them he was a Jew. Now, the fact that it says that they told Haman, where is it here? Yeah, he would not listen. They told Haman. So it almost makes me wonder if maybe Haman didn't notice it at first. I don't know how many attendants were there or how it works, but Haman's going by, Mordecai is not bowing down, and at some point it gets pointed out to him, hey, he's not bowing down. Haman then, I guess, looks into it and notices, sure enough, there is a guy that will not bow down whenever I walk by. Does he not know that's the rule? And day after day, even after being informed of the rule, he will not do it. And what happens? Haman gets very angry. Verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him homage, he was filled with rage. And when he learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity, because remember the people that told on him said he was a Jew, assuming that that's the reason why he wouldn't bow down. And when they learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity, Haman decided not to do away with Mordecai alone. He planned to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout Ahasuerus' kingdom. So I think under normal circumstances, probably if you are the second in command of this area under the king, and you're walking by and everyone's bowing down to you except for this one dude, I think under normal circumstances you would just say, let's kill that one dude, right? Off with his head, he will not obey, we don't tolerate that around here. But in this particular case, Haman gets so angry that he decides, I'm not going to just kill Mordecai, I'm going to kill every single person who was ever related to him. Every single person who traces their descendants back to Israel. We're going to kill all of them. His cousins and his third cousins and his fourth cousins and his uncles and every single descendant from Abraham. We're going to go back. We're going to kill every single one of them across the entire kingdom. Verse 7. In the first month, the month of Nisan, in King Ahasuerus' 12th year, that is the lot, was cast before Haman for each day and each month, and it fell on the 12th month, the month Adar. Now this particular verse seems like it's not even an important verse in Esther, but it actually becomes important, especially this word right here, when we get to the end of the book of Esther. So what Haman does here is he casts lots, and that's, I guess, the closest equivalent we have to casting lots would be rolling dice. So it would be a game of chance and see what it turns up on. And so he is rolling dice or casting lots, kind of letting just the random chance choose which month and which day in the month he is going to slaughter all the Jewish people. He's letting chance, I guess, he's letting the lot cast decide that. The lot is called Pur. That's going to matter when we get to the second half of the book because the festival is called Purim. And Purim is called Purim because of that reason. We are celebrating the occasion when Haman cast his lot, his Pur, against us, and God rescued us. So he cast the lot on the first month, and it indicates the 12th month as the time to do it. It could very well be that Jewish people reading this story, especially early on, would have noticed that and thought, that was God. That was God. Because the lot that is cast, and just so you know, there's actually a proverb in the book of Proverbs that says the lot is cast in the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. And so I think Hebrew people believed God's in charge of the way the dice roll. He's in charge of everything, and he's in charge of the way the dice lands. And in this case, Haman says, I'm going to kill them, right? It's the first month. So out of all this year, when should I do it? And he rolls, and it's as far away as possible, right? It's 11 and a half months away, which gives the Jewish people 11 and a half months to figure out what to do. So that's the Pur. Verse 8. Then Haman informed King Ahasuerus, there is one ethnic group, scattered throughout the peoples in every province of your kingdom, yet living in isolation. Their laws are different from everyone else's, and they do not obey the king's laws. Okay, especially one of them does not bow down to me. He doesn't say that here, but that's the thing. They do their own thing. They think they get to just do their own thing. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If the king approves, let an order be drawn up authorizing their destruction, and I will pay 375 tons of silver, I guess, to finance this new legislation, to the accountants for deposit in the royal treasury. He says, let's have slaughter the Jewish people day. And the king, verse 10 says, the king removed his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jewish people. And then the king told Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with as you see fit. And again, I'll just summarize the rest of this chapter. But what happens in the rest of this chapter is Haman, he has persuaded the king to allow him to pass slaughter the Jews day into law. And so the way that the lot was cast, it was this particular day in the 12th month, that's going to be the day that we kill the Jewish people. And now we sign it into law. It is official legislation. The king has approved it. And now we will write it all out, and we will give it to messengers, and the messengers will get on horses, and they will go to all the provinces of the kingdom, and they will inform all of the people in Persia that on 12th month, such and such day, I think maybe it was the 13th day, the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month, that is when we will, in fact it says, that you guys don't have this back there, but I'll just go read it, that you destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jewish people, young and old, women and children, and plunder their possessions on a single day. So that's a new law, and they send out the messengers to the whole kingdom. This new law upsets probably a lot of people. Mordecai is one of them. Chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had occurred, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went into the middle of the city and cried loudly and bitterly. And then for the rest of this chapter, you have a conversation between Esther and Mordecai, but the conversation is mediated through a messenger. So I don't understand it enough to know, other than just, obviously, Mordecai and Esther were not allowed to just go to lunch together and talk face to face. So in this chapter, you see a messenger going back and forth. Esther sends a messenger to Mordecai. Hey, I heard you're weeping bitterly in the middle of the city with sackcloth and ashes. What's going on? Mordecai sends a message back to Esther. Because there's a new law, slaughter all the Jewish people day. Maybe you haven't heard of it. Are you going to do anything about it? You're the queen. Could you please talk to your husband and get this undone? And then she writes back a message and sends it to Mordecai and says, I can't do anything about it. I don't even know if he likes me. I can't even get into the court right now. I can't even go in there and talk to him right now. And so I'm going to start reading at that point, verse 10. Esther spoke to Hegai, that's the messenger, and commanded him to tell Mordecai, all the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that one law applies to every man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courtyard who has not been summoned. The death penalty. Remember how he wouldn't see any of the other women unless he summoned them? This is similar to that. You want to hang out with the king, you got to be summoned. So Mordecai says, you're the queen, could you please do something about this? And she goes, no, I'm not even allowed to walk in there uninvited. In fact, the way she says it, she says, if anybody goes in there when they have not been summoned, what happens to them is the death penalty, and then I'll read the rest of it. Only if the king extends the gold scepter will that person live. I have not been summoned to appear before the king for the last 30 days. Esther's response was reported to Mordecai. So I think what she's saying is this. She's saying, Mordecai, first of all, you know the rule. You can't just waltz into the king's office and talk with him about whatever you want. He has to summon you. If you just try to walk in there without being invited, you die. They kill you. That's what they do. That's the rule. Now, there is a sense in which we can somewhat understand this in the idea that we live in a country and we have a president that you can't just walk on in, right, and just go talk to him. There's nobody in this room, I don't think, that has the ability to just go, I think I'm just going to waltz into the Oval Office and I'm going to give him a piece of my mind. You don't get to do that. You're not allowed to be able to just go and talk to him whenever you want. And in fact, if you tried, depending on how aggressively you tried to do it, you could end up dead for trying to do that. The thing that's unusual probably for us in this situation would be that it would apply to his wife, that she can't even go in there. But apparently, she can't go in there or she'll be killed, and it says only if the king extends the gold scepter. So apparently there is an exception. Someone can come in without an appointment, and if he has his gold scepter, he can point to the person, and that lets the people know, okay, don't kill that one. There's a section to the rule, and let him in. And she's not confident that that would happen, right? She says, it has been 30 days since I've been summoned. And I had never thought about this before until this week when I was reading commentaries on the book of Esther, and I now realize the reason she brings that up is probably to say this. I don't know that he even likes me. I don't have influence over him like I used to. I mean, back with the whole assassination thing, you told me, I told him, but it's not like that anymore. I haven't seen him in a month. And one of the commentaries that I read said something that I'm sure is true, but I just never thought of it. The commentator wrote, it is unlikely that the king was sleeping alone for those 30 days. So she has not been summoned for 30 days, but it's not like he's doing nothing, right? He's moved on to other people, and she's now going, Mordecai, you want me to go in there and somehow change his mind when I haven't seen him for a month and I don't know who he's moved on to now. I don't know that he cares what I think anymore. Verse 13, Mordecai told the messenger to reply to Esther, don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. Don't think, oh, you're the queen, you'll be fine. That's not happening here. Look at verse 14. If you keep silent at this time, liberation and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place. But you and your father's house will be destroyed. And by your father's house, I can only assume he means like them, like their immediate relatives. You and your father's house will be destroyed. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. After that, I will go to the king, even if it is against the law. If I perish, I perish. When you look at this last little paragraph, and that's where we're going to end, like that's part 1 of the book of Esther, and we'll get to the second half next week. But when you look at this, the way that chapter 4 ends, I want you to notice Mordecai's faith. Look at verse 14. If you keep silent at this time, liberation and deliverance, what's it say? Will come to the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will be destroyed. So he's saying, if you think you're going to say nothing, you'll be fine. If you say nothing, you're going to die. I'm going to die. Your immediate family is going to die. But this is what's interesting. Mordecai does not say to Esther, you're the queen and you've got to do something, and if you don't do something, all of the Jewish people are going to be obliterated. That's not what he says. He says, no, the Jewish people, deliverance will come to them from another place. God's going to rescue them somehow. Isn't that interesting? He doesn't say they're all going to die. No, they're going to be delivered. And then he basically says, so why not let you be the one? God's going to deliver his people. Why not you be the one that makes it happen? Why not let it be you? And so Esther risks her life. Verse 16. She calls them to fast, and she says, after 3 days, I'm going to go in there. I know it's against the law. I know they kill people for it. And if I perish, I perish. But I'm going to go talk to him. Now, is she being dramatic here? I mean, I think 2,500 years later, we can look back at the story and go, oh, please, it was her husband. Did she really think anything was going to happen? I think her fear was real. Do you remember Vashti? Esther was well aware that the reason she was in the position she was in was because the girl before didn't obey everything he said. She knows what she's doing here. I think that if I perish is not like, well, I think she's thinking that could happen. That's a real possibility. But I'll do something about this. And so that's part 1 of the book of Esther, and we'll try to do the whole second half next week. Let me just conclude with a brief application from what I think are the most famous words in the book of Esther. The most famous part of the book of Esther, as best as I can tell whenever I hear people talk about Esther, would be the second half of chapter 4, verse 14. Mordecai ends his little section by saying this, who knows, perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Who knows, perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Mordecai is bringing up these kind of topics to Esther. He is saying, why has God put you where he's put you? Think about it, Hadassah. Why has God put you where he's put you? Maybe you aren't there by accident. Maybe you aren't the secret Jewish queen of Persia on the same year that Kill the Jews Day got signed into law. Maybe that's not an accident. It reminds me of that line in the song we sang earlier, and though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. That's the point of the book of Esther. So he says, maybe you're not there by accident. Esther, what should you do with the position that God has put you in? And so what I wanted to do is just end by kind of asking you those same kinds of questions. Like I know in this room this morning, we are not queens of Persia. But I want you to think about those same kinds of thoughts. Why has God put you where he's put you? Like, why is your life the way it is? Is your life the way it is purely by accident? Is it 100% the result of all the decisions you've made? Why has God put you where he put? Think about your job that you have, the family that he's placed you in, your financial status, the influence that you have over persons or organizations or whatever, the relationships that you have. Maybe you aren't there by accident. So what should you do with the position you're in? What should you do with the location God has you in? What should you do with the situation you are in? I mean, based on what you know about God, based on what you know about His Word, based on what you know His Word says His will is, what should you do in light of the position you're in? And so think about that. And Lord willing, we will get to the rest of the story next week. Let's pray. God, I believe that the lot is cast in the lap, and its every decision is from the Lord. I think you know everything. I think you know everything that's going to happen. I think you're. This is my Father's world, and I don't think you're separate from it. I mean, I know you're separate from it in the sense that you are not the world. You created the world, but you are involved in your world, and we're in your world, and you're involved in our lives. And I think everybody here, whether they're a Christian or not, you're involved in all of our lives. But for those of us who know you, it's really, really comforting to be able to say, this is my Father's world. He's in charge of it, and He's in my life, and He's not against me. I pray that if there's anybody here who does not know you, that they would place their trust and faith in Jesus Christ even this week, this day, so that they would be in a world that is the same world they're in, with the same God, but it would be their Father's world. And they would know He is for them and not against them. You're in charge of everything. You're in charge of the details of our lives. I believe that. And yet, Mordecai says, Esther, if you do this, it'll be this way, but why not do it this way? And I just pray we would be the kind of people that go, why not let it be me? I want to serve God as best I know how with the situations He's placed in my hands. And I pray you'd help us to live that way. We love you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Let me end with these good words from God's Word. We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, those who are called according to His purpose. That is good news.